Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to East Central Missouri and the world, and welcome to the James Strong Show podcast number 212. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for making us a part of your day. I appreciate it. This podcast was recorded on the morning of Saturday, March the 20th, from the James Strong Studio in Western St. Charles County. The podcast today is going to be on the Father of Ufology, or perhaps the grandfather of ufology. Stanton Friedman is considered the father of ufology in many circles. But before Stanton Friedman, before any of these guys, was J. Allen Hynek. And if Stanton Friedman is the father of ufology, then J. Allen Hynek is the grandfather of ufology. He was a skeptic turned believer. He was a government employee, I guess you would say. He worked for the US government and the Air Force to debunk UFOs and to, you could say, whitewash. You could say he was just a debunker. He wanted to, the government hired him and others to put the kibosh on all these UFO sightings, okay? And he coined many terms: swamp gas, Venus, close encounters of the first, second, third kind. Those were all J. Allen Hynek's monikers. So we'll talk about J. Allen Hynek, the grandfather of ufology, in today's podcast. Before we do that, though, I did want to briefly give an update on the restoration project for the 1951 Jaguar Mark 7. Had some help the last 2 weeks from one of my brothers, and that was very helpful. Got some work done. And I've posted these pictures on the James Strong Show Facebook page, so you may want to take a look at those if you're interested. But basically, progress is slow on a vehicle like this. As I mentioned before, the easy stuff was done about a month ago, and the hard stuff is now what we're working on. The stuff with the frozen bolts. It's a 70-year-old car, so stuff just doesn't come off easily. And we're finding that we cut off and break off more bolts than actually come loose. But the interior is all out. It's all cleaned out, all the seats, all the everything, the upholstery, the carpet, everything, with the exception of the windshield, the back glass, and the dashboard. So, and again, I've taken pictures of that interior, the stripped interior, and it's on the James Strong Show Facebook page. So on to our podcast on the grandfather of ufology, J. Allen Hynek. He was born a long time ago, 1910. So he was born in Chicago in 1910. Back in 1931, he received a bachelor's degree from the University of Chicago. In 1935, he completed his PhD in astrophysics at Syracuse University. He joined the Department of Physics and Astronomy at Ohio State University in 1936, and he specialized in the study of stellar evolution and the identification of spectroscopic binary stars. He was a scientist and a brilliant man. And that's an impressive resume. And Hynek, perhaps, again, like I said before, not Stanton Friedman, is considered by many to be the father of ufology, maybe the grandfather, okay? Other things that Hynek did before he got into ufology, and I want to mention all these because I want to just explain who this guy was. This is not Richard Hoagland, okay? This is not a guy who would have been on Coast to Coast. This wasn't a pseudoscientist with a name doctor in front of him who was really like Dr. J is a doctor, okay? Not that kind of a doctor, a real live astrophysicist who started as a skeptic and began and ended up as a believer. But during World War II, Hynek was a civilian scientist at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, and he actually helped develop the United States Navy's radio proximity fuse. So he was an electronics guy too. After the war, Hynek returned to the Department of Physics and Astronomy at Ohio State. He rose to professor in 1950, In 1953, Hynek submitted a report on the fluctuations in the brightness and color of starlight and daylight, with an emphasis on daylight observations. In 1956, he left to join Professor Fred Whipple, a Harvard astronomer at the Smithsonian Astrophysical Observatory, which had combined with a Harvard observatory at Harvard. Now, Hynek had the assignment of directing the tracking of an American space satellite, a project for the International Geophysical Year, and in 1956 and thereafter he did that. Now, in addition to over 200 teams of amateur scientists around the world that were part of Operation Moonwatch, there were also 12 photographic Baker-Nunn stations. This was a special camera that was devised for the task of a prototype that was built and tested and then stripped apart again. On October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union launched a satellite, Sputnik 1, so he was in charge of watching that too. Now, after he completed his work on the satellite program, Hynek went back to teaching. He took the position of professor and chairman of the astronomy department at Northwestern University. Now, that's his resume. That's the stuff he did that has nothing to do with ufology. So, I mentioned this to set the bar, to explain why this guy's beliefs were so important. Well, Hynek was just going along, minding his own business, and then in July 1947, we had an interesting occurrence. Something crashed on a ranch near Roswell, New Mexico. The Roswell Daily Record, the local newspaper, reported that the RAAF, which was the precursor to the United States Air Force, had captured a flying saucer. The Cobra was now out of the cage. Now, in response to numerous reports of flying saucers after the Roswell incident, the United States Air Force established Project Sign in 1948 to examine sightings of unidentified flying objects. Hynek was contacted to act as a special consultant to Project Sign. He studied UFO reports and decided whether the phenomena described herein suggested astronomical objects. In other words, were people really seeing something? Now, when Project Sign hired Hynek, he was skeptical of UFO reports. In fact, Hynek suspected that they were made by unreliable witnesses or by persons who had misidentified man-made or natural objects. In 1948, Hynek actually said, "The whole subject seems utterly ridiculous," and described it as a fad that would soon pass. In fact, in his 1977 book, Hynek said that he enjoyed his role as a debunker for the Air Force. He enjoyed debunking these silly people who made these silly accusations. He also said that his debunking was exactly what the Air Force expected of him. Now, back in April 1953, 5 years into his task, Hynek wrote a report for the Journal of Optical Society of America entitled Unusual Aerial Phenomena, which contained one of his best-known statements. Now, ridicule was not part of the scientific method. This is what Hynek is writing. Ridicule is not part of the scientific method, and people should not be taught that it is. The steady flow of reports, often made in concert by reliable observers, raises question of the scientific obligation and responsibility. Is there any residue that is worthy of scientific attention? Or, if there isn't, does an obligation exist to say so to the public, not in words of open ridicule, but seriously, to keep the faith with the trust that the public places in science and scientists would prevail? In other words, the door was cracked open. Hynek is saying, look, we just don't need to mock and ridicule people who said they've seen something. We need to take their sightings, their opinions, their statements as fact. The fact being not that they saw a UFO, the fact being that they saw something. And we owe it to these people to explain to them what it was they saw, not to ridicule and make fun of them. If it's something that's explainable, explain to them. This is swamp gas. This is this. This is that. But don't ridicule them, but truly find out what the absolute thing was that they saw. Again, the door was cracked open because that's not what the Air Force was expecting out of J. Allen Hynek. Now, in 1953, there was an associate member for the Robinson panel which concluded that there was nothing autonomous about UFOs and that a public relations campaign should be undertaken to debunk the subject and reduce public interest. Hynek would later lament that the Robinson panel had helped make UFOs a disputable field of study. In other words, the government was going to put the kibosh on all these UFO sightings. As UFO reports continued to be made, some of the testimonies, especially by military pilots and police officers, were deeply puzzling to Hynek. He once said, "As a scientist, I must be mindful of the lessons of the past. All too often it has happened that matters of great value to science were overlooked because the new phenomena did not fit the accepted scientific outlook of the time." In other words, military pilots and policemen were very reliable witnesses. In other words, he was being told to just debunk all this stuff. That's not the scientific way to approach it. Now, in a 1985 interview, when asked what caused his change in opinion, Hynek responded, two things really. One was the completely negative and unyielding attitude of the Air Force. They wouldn't give UFOs the chance of existing, even if they were flying up and down the street in broad daylight. Everything had to have an explanation. I began to resent that, even though I basically felt the same way, because I still thought they weren't going about it the right way. You can't assume that everything is black no matter what. Secondly, the caliber of the witnesses began to trouble me. Quite a few instances were reported by military pilots, for example, and I knew them to be fairly well trained. So this is when I first began to think, well, maybe there is something to all of this. Hynek remained with Project Sign, and that turned into Project Grudge. Project Grudge was then replaced by Project Blue Book. You've heard of that. And that was back in early 1952. Hynek stayed on still as a scientific consultant. Now, Air Force Captain Edward J. Ruppelt, Blue Book's first director, held Hynek in very high regard. In fact, he was quoted as saying, "Hynek was one of the most impressive scientists I met while working on the UFO project, and I met a good many. He didn't do two things that some of them did. He didn't give you answers before he knew the question, or he didn't immediately begin to expound on his accomplishments in the field of science." In other words, he didn't play by the Air Force's playbook, and he wasn't a notice me type of guy. Now, even though Hynek thought Ruppelt was a capable director who steered Project Blue Book in the right direction, Ruppelt headed Blue Book for only a few years. Now, Hynek also stated his opinion that after Ruppelt's departure, Project Blue Book was little more than a public relations exercise, further noting that there was little or no research undertaken using any scientific method. This is the time when Hynek began occasionally disagreeing publicly with the conclusions of Project Blue Book. Now, by the early 1960s, after a decade and a half of study, Clark writes that Hynek's apparent turnaround in the UFO question was an open secret. Only after Blue Book was formally dissolved did Hynek speak more openly about his turnaround, because the government was in fact his employer. Hynek speculated that his personality was a factor in the Air Force keeping him on as a consultant for over 2 decades. They liked the guy. They liked his work. He was very, very reputable. Other ufologists thought that Hynek was being disingenuous or even deceitful in his turnaround. Now, physicist James E. McDonald, for example, wrote to Hynek in 1970, reprimanding him for what McDonald saw as his lapses, suggesting that when evaluated by later generations, retired Marine Corps Major Donald Keyhoe would be regarded as a more objective, honest, and